Right, so we're now at that point where if you're the sort of world leader, or politician generally, that doesn't want to attack Iran at Israel's behest, you aren't worth the time to waste on by them, as David Lammy has discovered, upon scuttling back to Israel again to offer yet more UK support to them in their hour of greatest self-inflicted need. That retaliation from Iran that has been hanging over the heads of Netanyahu and his government like a sword of Damocles for the last fortnight since their assassination strike in Tehran that successfully took out the chief peace negotiator for Hamas. The UK has decided to continue to support Israel even through that, because of course we have. Just as Israel have meted out 10 months of genocide across Gaza. Just as Israel have invited retaliation by other nations coming to the defence of the defenceless people of Gaza. Defending Israel against that first retaliation for Iran, as the UK did. Attacks on the Houthis for blockading shipping, as the UK has carried out. And of course continuing to supply Israel with armaments and military aid come what may. Reassurances to try to avoid all-out war, despite having taken a side to all intents and purposes, infiltrated even, some might say, harks back to the appeasement of Neville Chamberlain of Hitler in the 1930s. Except with Starmer's Labour, the appeasement is unshakable and absolute. So does that not make them even worse then? Right, so Labour's David Lammy has run off back to Israel yet again, even as his own department back here, our Foreign Office that he's meant to be in charge of, is cracking up, as following his departure for Israel again, the second trip he's made there since becoming Foreign Secretary just 6 weeks ago. One of his chief diplomats have just quit, a story that has now been circulating for around 48 hours at time of writing, yet is still vigorously being ignored by the mainstream media. Has a D notice been issued over that? It's a bit petulant, isn't it? Because actually the lack of any mainstream coverage on that story is really summing up just how utterly useless and biased they are towards whoever happens to be running the country. Well, Lammy really should have been rushing back to deal with that matter and get his own house in order. Instead, he remains in Israel. Who is more important, it makes you wonder. The country you're meant to represent, or the one which Lammy has taken some £33,000 in donations from supporters of. Making matters worse for Lammy, though, is the fact he has been completely ignored by Benjamin Netanyahu out there upon his return to Israel. No egregious flesh-pressing photo with him this time, though as this one shows, no matter what the slight, as long as there is someone to press the flesh with in the Israeli government, he'll do. So, as with this picture here with Lammy and his French counterpart Stéphane Séjourne there, shaking hands, looking oh so pally and friendly with each other, aren't they? With Israel's Foreign Affairs Minister Israel Katz shows. This, of course, is just the latest example of the UK rushing to the aid of Israel when they are the instigators of the situation now being observed. Talk of matters expanding to take in more nations in direct involvement, and Israel expecting its Western allies to come to its aid militarily if Iran does strike. Or when Iran does strike. It's not so much an if with them, is it? Here's another photo of Lammy and Sojourn with Israel Katz. This one, a photograph that Katz shared himself. And it was a quote tweet from electronic Antifada journalist Asa Winstanley to that post from Katz that gave me the idea for this video, basically. Because Winstanley said in response to that frankly vomit-inducing image was the active support of David Lammy and the Labour government for Israel's Holocaust in Gaza will go down in history as worse than Chamberlain's appeasement of Hitler. And this did get me thinking, because right now Labour are involving themselves heavily with Israel, and only Israel, one side of the equation. If you consider Iran right now to be the other side of that for argument's sake, there are obviously other nations and groups to consider in actuality, of course. But it's not like we're very welcome in Iran ourselves here in the UK. You show up there with a British passport, for example, that will invite all sorts of attention you wouldn't really want. But why should that be a surprise when they are basically labelled the boogeyman in the Middle East by the likes of us? For all the justifiable issues you can highlight with Iran, all the equalities issues, the clampdowns on freedom of expression, the merciless justice system they have, they are not the drivers of this conflict in the Middle East. They've been on the receiving end of it, and Israel made their strike on Iranian soil knowing they wouldn't just take it. You can criticise Iran all you like for all manner of reasons, but that isn't the point right now. That isn't what has got us to where we are today. That has been driven single-handedly by Israel. Netanyahu's actions in response to October 7th have invited nothing but appeasement. Sunak, before whilst in power up until 6 weeks ago, was no different. He was an appeaser too. But the stakes have been raised. Israel directly struck Iran. Labour are in government now, and instead of suing to meet Iran as well for peace, Lammy is busy shaking hands in Israel again, all whilst apparently saying, no, we're not going to hit Iran for you. Netanyahu has ignored Lammy on this visit as a direct result of that, as well as apparently not being very happy with him for having told him when he visited the first time that the UK would continue to try and block the arrest warrant for him at the International Criminal Court. Lammy overruled on that, it would appear, after he came back home. What can I say, Dave? You just aren't bowing and scraping low enough anymore, are you? All of this is obviously reminiscent, as Asa Winstanley made mention of the appeasement of Neville Chamberlain of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s to try and stave off a wider war then, unsuccessfully as that was. And the parallels between Germany then and Israel now are pretty blatant to a lot of people. Israel refuses to back down from driving this war, and is now looking likely to escalate. And the only weapon deployed by Labour appears to be appeasement. You can't appeal to people hell-bent on war. Hitler was hell-bent on it, so is Netanyahu, because him remaining in power in Israel relies on this conflict continuing. His coalition will collapse if it doesn't. And before someone pipes up that it is anti-Semitic to make such a comparison, for one, it is not racist if it is true, and for two, religion has nothing to do with this argument of appeasement, because this is politics. And playing the race card, all that does is drive people into silence, and atrocity happens when we all lack the courage to speak out. Nobody in their right mind wants to see war happen, but equally those driving it, come what may, clearly cannot be in their right minds, so why appease them? Hitler entered the Rhineland in 1936. That wasn't good enough. He annexed Austria in 1938. That was bad news as well. Chamberlain, in appeasement, offered up the Sudetenland to Hitler later that year, the German-speaking part of what was Czechoslovakia, in the hope that would end his expansionist proclivities, that would satisfy him. But of course it didn't. You give such a person an inch, they take a mile. Though in this case that ended up being the rest of Czechoslovakia just 6 months later, and after 6 more months of Chamberlain hand-wringing, Hitler invaded Poland and we ended up at war. Appeasement doesn't work, and yet here we have our Labour government, Lammy, he and half of his front bench colleagues, having taken pro-Israel donations, can be seen as compromised as well as appeasers, as members of Netanyahu's hard-right cabinet have expansionist desires as well. We already know about them. They want Gaza for their settlers. Netanyahu has allowed his finance minister Bezalel Smotrich to seize powers from the IDF in the West Bank and has signed off on more settlements to be built there. That's more Israeli expansionism. And the more that people do not stand up for that, the more our government do not. That's more appeasement as we watch it happen. Our politicians sit on their hands, and should they get their way, should Palestine ultimately be wiped from the face of the earth by Israel, why would they stop there? They wouldn't. In fact, we already have Israel on record as saying that wouldn't be it. We have history telling us that wouldn't be it, as after that it would be Lebanon again, wouldn't it? Again. If not for decades of Israeli expansionist desires, the likes of Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon might never have come into existence. May never have come into being. So any alliance with Israel, any turning of a blind eye to their actions and all that time, that was appeasement too. You kind of get it from the perspective that Israel was a UK-made monster, I guess. That to turn on them now would be to admit a mistake, that it didn't work, that to provide this land for the Jewish people, for the Zionist campaigners and that movement, to admit that was a mistake, as it's turned out to be a mistake. But that would require taking blame for it. That would require taking responsibility, blame for what has happened since. But that shouldn't be a burden for today's politicians. The mistakes made were made by those politicians that came before. But by continuing to appease them today, well then you must be held responsible for that yourselves. The French called Neville Chamberlain Monsieur J'aime Berlin, Mr. I love Berlin. We call Keir Starmer Tel Aviv Keith, don't we? Two not dissimilar names earned for not at all dissimilar reasons. Whilst Labour insist on placating Israel, defending Israel against those they have attacked should that soon once again come to pass, the history books will not remember them kindly. And deservedly so, and like Chamberlain, the appeasement won't change a damn thing. Israel must be taken to task, brought to book, held to account, and anyone appeasing them and allying with them damn well ought to be as well, because you aren't helping the situation, you're hindering it. For more on that story of the Foreign Office diplomat who has quit his post, citing Labour's government complicity in war crimes for continuing to arm Israel inexcusably, especially since the mainstream media continue to ignore it. Oh, more appeasement! Check out this video recommendation here to explain all, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.